Hello and welcome to Tattvadeep Conversations and Explorations. For our seventh and final episode on language, we sat down with Professor Martin Hilpert. Dr. Hilpert is a professor of English linguistics at the University of Neuchâtel. He holds a PhD from Rice University and did his postdoctoral research at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley and at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies. His areas of focus are cognitive linguistics, language change, construction grammar, and corpus linguistics. He has authored 4 books on language: Germanic Future Constructions, 2008, Constructional Change in English, 2013, Construction Grammar and its Application to English, 2019, and 10 lectures on Diachronic Construction Grammar, 2021. In this interview, Professor Hilpert talked about the role of linguistics in observing, documenting, and even maintaining the complexity, diversity, and the richness that languages bring to our ways of thought, life, and evolution. We hope this conversation can help the listeners see the tattva, or true essence of their own mother tongue, along with the values and meanings embedded within the structure of the different languages of our world and their strong interconnectedness. Hello, everyone. We are having Dr. Martin Hilpert today. He's a linguist, and we will be talking about his work and the science of linguistics during this conversation. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for taking the time out to talk to us.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
My first question to you, Professor, is your work has been, whenever we listen to you, you point out certain aspects of society which is in a way lacking, like, for example, equality, how we use words, especially when you're talking about pidgin languages, how pidgin is considered to be not enough or lacking character. Creole is lacking character. Certain words that we use to, people fought against the usage of languages to get them abolished, to get them removed from mainstream vocabulary. You have been working, when we listen to you, we get something from that. We get that you are working towards clearing up certain wrong notions. So in that aspect, what, according to you, is the role of linguists in society? We can start there.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Language is something that we use every day. We're surrounded by it. And we're so familiar with it that we barely notice that it's there and that it does a certain kind of work. One aspect of that is that we attach values and ideas to ways of using language, to ways of talking. So there are languages that sound very romantic and positive to us, and then there are maybe other or languages where we don't have these positive associations. And because language is so immediate, we tend not to reflect that at all. So there, linguists can actually point something out to ordinary users of language, namely that quite often we make judgments that are not based in fact, really, but that come about through associations with language. Yeah, so that is very important to reflect. You mentioned pidgin languages. So one value judgment that many people make is to attach a certain value to the standard variety of a language. The variety that is maybe taught in schools or that is represented in the media, or, well, that you associate with certain institutions. And it is easy for people to believe that if the way they use language differs from that it's somewhat less valid or less important, which to a linguist is not at all the case. We are interested in the full richness and the full variety of language. And the varieties that have come to be used as standards, they're just one aspect of this. So no variety is more or less important or more or less interesting or more or less correct than another. To a linguist, each variety, each way that language is used is of exactly equal importance.
You're saying that to stress this point that all languages are important. So you consider to stress this point is the role of linguists in society. Is that what you're saying?
So definitely, I think linguists have a responsibility to make this point clear and to reassure maybe speakers of all kinds of varieties that, well, their way of talking matters and is of great interest to, well, not only to linguists, but to the communities who are using these languages.
Okay. But is that not clashing with the movement that the world is going today? Like, we find efficiency in homogenization. Things work better when we all speak the same language. In India, we were taught after the English left, and then there was a revival during the 2000s, late 90s. We were given a formal standard, a format for writing business communication. I worked in advertising, so we were very clearly given the number of words in a headline, so on and so forth. So how do you say this? Because to me, it looks like a clash, because you are celebrating this variety, this vibrant clash, but on the other side is efficiency, to be standard, to be very clear and precise, no room for errors. So how do you see, where do you stand in this clash?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So of course, one could ask the question, wouldn't it be easier if everyone were to use exactly the same language? If there was only one language on earth, would that not avoid misunderstanding? Would it not make communication a lot more efficient? And the simple truth of the matter is that there will never be just a single homogeneous way of communicating between human beings. There are several reasons for that. So the first reason is that in human society, not everybody communicates with everybody else to the same extent. There are always communities and subcommunities of those. And within community, we approximate each other's linguistic behavior. So when I talk to people that I'm close to, the way we are using language becomes more similar. And well, if this happens in one single conversation, it may seem like there's not a big consequence to that. But in fact, this process over time shapes dialects, and these dialects then go on to become languages in their own right. So it's this process that has, for example, created the divisions between languages such as French and Italian, which go back to a common ancestor, but different dialects formed, and those dialects then went on to become languages of their own with dialects of their own. And this process repeats and unfolds continuously. And this will be true for as long people live as they are doing today. Close contacts to people you know well, and then not so close contacts to people who live in other places.
Okay. This evolutionary changes of language itself is fascinating, because I speak Tamil, and there are many kinds of Tamil today, and I teach Tamil also. I teach spoken Tamil. One of the fascinating things that the Indian languages have a way of including English verbs in a Tamil sentence. The verb do goes as an auxiliary to the English verb, and that the local do verb in the local language gets conjugated.
I see.
So looking at these changes is fascinating. Teaching people a new language is also fascinating, because especially a language like Tamil, where it is not standardized, and according to you, language anyway is not standardized. Languages are not standardized. That is another question I want to ask you. Can we say that language is standardized? Is there a standard? If there is a standard, what's the standard? But before that, what I see is when I teach person A a word and a person B a word, the way they say that word is different, but to my ears, I understand the meaning goes in. And over years, perhaps, two new streams of word pronouncing this word in that way would gather momentum and become a dialect, eventually form something. When things are so open, how are we not losing the fundamental grammar of any language? How is that not being tampered? Why are we not losing control? With all of this, we still have not lost control over English or Tamil or any other language of the world.
Another excellent question. So languages change all the time, and you are correct in your assessment. There are continuous processes of erosion, so that, for example, words are pronounced less carefully, they're pronounced in a shorter way, some sounds are left out, and at the end you have something that seems to have a lot less structure. So if I give an example from the English language, so I can express future time with the be going to construction, and I can say, I'm going to talk to Jasper this afternoon. But I can also shorten that to say, I'm going to talk to Jasper this afternoon, or even shorter, I'm going to talk to Jasper this afternoon. Now, given this process, is it possible that language just over time crumbles into a piece of dust and there is nothing left? And speakers are no longer able to express the meanings that they want to convey. Now, the erosion process is real, but at the same time, new structures are always coming into languages. So speakers come up with new ways of expressing old meanings. So for example, be going to was actually an alternative to expressions of future time that were already available, like the auxiliary will, for example. And you notice that will, for example, is already much smaller and has much less phonetic substance. So when I say, I'll talk to Jasper this afternoon, it's really just that one consonant.
Yeah.
And so linguists have been observing this in lots and lots of languages, that new constructions, new expressions, both lexical words, but also these grammatical markers, like, for example, markers of future time, emerge and become integrated into the grammatical inventory of a language. So language is continuously renewing itself. And the complexity that is lost on one end is actually gained at another end. And in this way, the potential, the communicative potential of language is actually maintained in every language that linguists have studied. So we are not aware of any language that would have collapsed or deteriorated to a degree where communication was no longer possible. With one exception, languages that are spoken only by very few speakers so that they die out. Yeah. So imagine a language that is maybe spoken in a remote village, and the language is no longer taught to children growing up, but it is exclusively spoken by older speakers. And then maybe those older speakers don't talk much to one another. Yeah. So there you can have situations in which those languages become less expressive or lose some of their richness and variety. Yeah, and of course, the end result would be that a language is no longer spoken by anyone at all, and in that case, the language dies. So that, unfortunately, is the case with almost half of the languages that are spoken on Earth today. Are likely to disappear within the next 2 generations. That is actually a quite dramatic development that is happening under our eyes, really.
Wow. So what are linguists doing about it? We in the series, the language series, we spoke to 2 language revivalists.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other work that is happening to contain the situation, or linguists just observing it? And is there any work, future-looking work?
Essentially, 2 strategies are being deployed. The one, as you mentioned, is language reviving, but there the work really has to be done with the community who's using that language. So that is very much community-based work. And linguists try to assist communities, for example, by developing learner materials, by assisting language teachers, and by advising on policy matters. So That's one aspect of it. And of course, linguists are also involved in documenting languages, which often is a necessary first step, since many languages that are endangered are not written and thus don't really have a chance of developing learning materials, for example.
Linguists are like X-ray machines to a language. You look into the language. And when you look into the language, you obviously see its potential, its power, and also its limitations.
Mm-hmm.
Language is the center of global communication. If two nation leaders of two nations, they speak, and in UN or any big organization, people are speaking and they don't speak each other's language. What do linguists feel about this? Knowing the limitations of language, how can we put all our eggs in one basket of language and to run the world?
I see your point. Yes, there are several things I could say. So one aspect, of course, is communication through translation or across languages, or communication in a second language that I don't know as well as my first language. So it is clear that those are limitations, but I would argue that the limitations lie more in the knowledge and use of language rather than in the language themselves. So as far as the communicative potential of languages is concerned, there I'm actually quite optimistic that pretty much any idea that you could have can be expressed using language. So there's a South American author, Jorge Luis Borges, who has come up with a fantastic thought experiment, namely the idea that if you use the characters of the alphabet and you come up with an infinite number of permutations of those characters, and you put those permutations in books that you store in an infinitely large library, you will find in that library the story of your life, the story of my life, the story of your life with a slight change in it, a story where the two of us would meet, not on Zoom, but in another context, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So this thought experiment really illustrates the enormous power of language, the variety of ideas that can be expressed. And so that is maybe where my optimism concerning the communicative potential of language comes from. But your point fully stands. Yeah. So when world leaders meet, usually they have translators, or they might use a third language that is not their own for communication. And obviously, that means that a lot of meaning is actually lost, that some nuances that we could convey to people we know well is not transmitted. And language actually is structured in such a way that only a fraction of the meaning that is communicated is directly in the words. Rather, when I say something to you, you as the hearer, you have an enormous task actually to flesh out the meanings of the words into the full idea of what it is that I wanted to convey to you. Yeah. So let me give you a simple example. A simple question like, oh, is it already 5 o'clock? That could mean I have to go. It could mean, shouldn't we call somebody if we had agreed that?
Or you didn't keep track of time. It could imply that you didn't keep track of time.
Right. So there are these interpretations, and as the hearer, you always try to anticipate what it is that the speaker is trying to tell you, and you use the words as a cue. So that your act of understanding language is really just the first step. And the interpretation is much richer and much more complex. Now, when something I say is being translated and then conveyed, that process of interpreting the original message is made much more difficult. Yeah. And that is why in these contexts, communication may not be as efficient. Also, similar example, if we communicate in a language that is not our first language, is not our own language in a way, the interpretation process is made more difficult as well. For example, because we may not know about all the connotation that a given word has. So all the meanings that may be evoked, but that escapes our knowledge of that particular language. So yeah, on the one hand, I would say language is an incredibly powerful tool, but our knowledge of language, our ability to use a certain language, that may be limited, and that is where communication difficulties might emerge.
The next one I would like to go into is you were talking about interpretation, power of interpretation, or the freedom in interpretation. So art and writing, poetry and songwriting is about interpretation, or interpreting emotions, and then further the listener is interpreting their own ideas. So in this, is there
Yes.
a study for studying the styles and trends of writing in art? Is there anything that we can know about the work being done in this area?
So the interpretation of texts and works of art has, of course, a long tradition in literary analysis. So that is something that is a neighboring discipline to linguistics, I would say, that has really a rich tradition of its own. But as far as linguistics is concerned, there is a special branch of linguistics that is concerned with the structure of texts. For example, in that kind of in that branch of linguistics, what is being studied is how the meanings of different sentences hang together. Yeah, so and how our interpretation is guided by elements that we find in different parts of a text. So let me just give you an example that might seem absurd at first. So imagine a speaker who says, "It is starting to rain. Please give me the book." Yeah? So it is starting to rain. Please give me the book. There is nothing that these sentences on the surface of it have in common. But if we hear them side by side, we arrive at an interpretation that tries to bring them in a mutual context. So it could be, for example, that the book is very valuable and I don't want it to get wet. So please give me the book so that I can put it into a bag that I have. Or it could be that I'm using that book as a kind of umbrella, so that I don't get wet. Any number of interpretations is possible. And so one thing that linguists have found is that there are virtually no limits to the creativity that hearers have when they assign an interpretation to the elements that are found in a text. So hearers are very, very proficient at projecting meaning into language use. So even with something that on the surface of it does not seem to have to do anything with each other, as a hearer, we will work with the assumption that the speaker would have had something in mind, so that these two things have something in common, something that's linked between those two.
What I wanted to ask is there a collective study of these kind of works coming out? For example, if you, I don't know if you've read any of V.S. Naipaul's work.
I'm sorry, no.
V.S. Naipaul, okay, he wrote, he's a Nobel laureate. He's no more. He wrote in Pidgin English.
Mm-hmm.
Not just everything. I mean, he's a very good writer, but because he was born and raised in the Caribbeans, he wrote a couple of stories, very famous stories like Suffrage of Elvira, which is about the second general elections in Trinidad. So the entire community speaks in a certain way. In one of your videos, you played Nigerian English or some African English you play. That's very similar to that. So you wrote the entire book like that. Another example is in India, we had a wonderful writer called Neela Padmanabhan. He wrote a book called Generations in Tamil. He wrote in Tamil and Malayalam. But one thing that stood out in his writing was he did not conform to standard Tamil. So his Tamil was very different. And the story was, it's very difficult for me to read also. I read the book in English. I couldn't read it in Tamil. It was very difficult because it was set in the 1930s in a particular region in South Tamil Nadu. So my question to you was, is there a dedicated group of linguists just studying arts, writings of these things and doing work on that?
Linguists are, of course, very much interested in these varieties of, not only English, but really all languages that are found. So when it comes to the language of individual authors, that would be something that is more of interest to, let's say, literary scholars who are interested in the body of work and the ideas that are conveyed and the ways in which the ideas are conveyed. So linguists would have a tendency to focus on aspects that relate to a language community as a whole. So maybe linguists would focus on groups of authors or
a time period.
Or so what I was thinking of was a comparison that involves multiple time periods, how language use evolves. Yeah. But individuals, an assumption has been that language is something that is shared between human beings. So the knowledge of language that I have is similar and almost identical, in fact, to the people who are living around me and that I talk to and that share this social practice of using language with me. So in linguistics in general, the focus has generally been more on the community of speakers and not so much on the individual. There's an important qualification of that I need to present. So very recently, linguists have become more interested in individual differences between speakers. All of us use a language, but do we really know the language in the same way? Do we use it in the same way? Do we have the same reasoning about the language? And there's really interesting empirical work that has been done that shows that no, speakers are not all the same. There are important things that are identical. So, for example, every human being that is neurotypical ends up speaking a language, at least one, but probably two or three or four. Children may start a little earlier or a little later. Well, how many people do you know who do not use language? If someone is not using language, then that means that they are seriously affected by some kind of trouble. So there are these similarities, but then there are differences, and these differences show up, for example, in the way speakers can reason about language itself. So one thing that linguists like to do in their studies is to ask ordinary speakers, do you think that this is a grammatically correct sentence in this language of yours? Yeah. And just to illustrate this with a simple example, a sentence like John gave Mary the book, that is perfectly fine. Yeah. But no matter who you ask as a speaker of English, everyone would agree that John gave Mary book the. That doesn't work. So the has to come before the book, and otherwise it does not work. Or John Mary the book gave. Well, no, that's not the place where the verb goes. It has to go in the other place. And so based on these kinds of findings, linguists for a long time assumed that our knowledge of language is really more or less the same. Yeah, no matter who you're talking to. But more fine-grained experiments of this kind have shown that there are sentences where people do not agree at all. Yeah? So there's not this kind of systematic agreement that we find with other grammatical patterns. And those patterns, the disagreements, they may be related to differences in variety. Yeah, so some variety allows some features while other varieties don't. But one important factor that also has been identified is that, well, the ability to make this kind of judgment, to say, yes, this is something that I would recognize as a grammatical sentence in my language. A lot of that comes with exposure to language. So people who are reading and writing for a living, forcibly, they are exposed to a lot more language. And people who have other professions, yeah, so maybe they use language in a spoken way to talk to people and to go about their work, but they would not be accustomed in the same way to seeing language written down on a page and taking it apart into its bits and pieces. So our use of language and our attitudes towards it and our ability to reason objectively about it, that differs a lot between individuals. And so that was my qualification with regard to the question, okay, do linguists care about the individual or about the language community? Most of the time, linguistic studies really address issues at the level of the linguistic community.
And because you were talking about linguists' interest in individuals' ability to speak language or styles of speaking, where does cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics feature here? Because it's about an individual or a small community than a language user community. What kind of work happens here, and what is the difference between these two branches?
Okay. Yeah. Good question. So cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics are two branches of linguistics that are interested in the cognitive processes that underlie language use. So basically, what happens in my brain when I do what I'm doing now, when I'm talking to you, what happens in your brain when you are understanding the words. You know, you hear the sounds and ideas start forming in your mind. What are the processes that underlie this phenomenon? Because it is quite remarkable, right? So I move my mouth, sounds come out, and other people form ideas and maybe go on to do things and change the world. So that is actually quite remarkable. Now, there are, of course, many aspects to this kind of work. So at the finest level where linguistics actually borders on natural science fields like biology, that would be the level of the brain. What kinds of processes are involved there? What brain areas, for example, are implicated in language processing? So there, we actually know quite a lot about how this works based on studies that use imaging techniques or are based on observations of patients with language impairments. But on a more general level, we can also analyze the cognitive processes that have to be in place in order for us to be able to hold a conversation, to speak. There are many general cognitive abilities, like, for example, the ability to reason with categories that are implicated in language use. When you think about it, a word such as pen or lamp or book, those are category labels. So a pen applies to the whole class of things that you can write with. Book, that's not just one thing, it is an entire category of things. So languages essentially do that. They express categories, not only things, but also actions. So the verb give describes the category of actions that can be labeled as acts of giving. And then, of course, there are lots of abstract things like justice and globalization. And you started this question
with cognitive cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics, their role and their...
Yeah. Coming back to the question of the individual and the community, psycholinguists, of course, test their ideas, their hypotheses with experiments that involve individuals. So you bring people into the laboratory and you have them do language-related tasks where they are presented with a linguistic stimulus and they have to react in a certain way. And from these reactions, then you draw conclusions about the cognitive processes that take place. So yes, individuals are involved in this kind of work, but really what we hope to find out are generalizations, things that are effectively the same for the different speakers that do this experiment. Well, that is something that also has come under a certain criticism in recent times, because most participants in ordinary psychology or psycholinguistics experiments actually come from a relatively limited segment of society. The participants of such experiments are typically young college students. So their background is already, well, has been selected in a way. And it's questionable whether that actually represents the entire linguistic community. Also there, a little bit of caution is in order. But generally, what cognitive linguists and psycholinguists try to find out is what general processes of cognition underlie language use that can be generalized, well, but basically to the entire human race, because all of us have language, all of us use language, and it is the assumption that the processes that underlie language, that allow us to use language, are the same. Because after all, one very basic observation is that human beings are the only living beings to have language, and none of the other species that are known have something that would be exactly the same as language. Animal species, of course, communicate. That's not the question. There is no disagreement about that. But none of these animal communication systems seem to work quite in the same way as human languages. Yeah? So when we look at the structures, when we look at the flexibility of language, when we look at the symbolic nature of linguistic science, all of that does not really match the communicative signs that animals are using. That doesn't take anything away from their dignity or their ability to feel emotions or think about the world or have thoughts and hopes and ideas. It just means that there is something different, and this difference, is embodied in language. Yeah, I don't know if you have another question that I could talk about.
Yeah, I also want to ask you about this. As the world comes together, becomes smaller, and people are coming together closer through internet and all of that, even without internet, ads, movies, products bring new words, ideas into our life. It's very easy. It's very easy for someone to say hola in Tamil Nadu, which is hello, and but how come it's easy for us to collect words, but we don't speak the language? It's difficult to learn a language. Why is that? Why is that we are picking up words very easily and not language?
What structures, what elements are borrowed from one language into another follows certain principles. As you very rightly observed, words are very easily borrowed. Elements like hello and goodbye, for example, that happens all the time. Words for technical equipment or food items, for example, those are among the first elements, or the elements that are borrowed the most easily from one language into another. But from there on, it actually gets increasingly difficult. Words like food items or technical devices, that requires almost no contact at all. So that can be indirect communication over the internet or through mass media. But for other types of borrowing, let's say the borrowing of discourse particles or borrowing of pronouns. Yeah, so for me and you and he, and so words like this and that, for example, that requires a bit more contact. That requires that people are actually talking to one another, and you observe these patterns in speech. And from there on, what is even more difficult to borrow, or what requires more language contact, are grammatical devices, grammatical constructions. So also that happens actually in situations of intense language contact where people are living side by side. There are what linguists call transfer phenomena. Speakers realize that, okay, in this one language that I'm using, I have to express a distinction. Like, for example, there are two ways of using the pronoun we. We, that could be what linguists call inclusive and exclusive we. Some languages make a difference between that, so that they have two pronouns, two we's, and others just have one. So let's say that in one of your languages, there is this distinction between inclusive and exclusive we, and in the other language, there's not. Yeah. So, and it is easy for a speaker to come to the conclusion, well, there really should be this distinction in the other language that I'm using. Let's say that I've just started to learn this other language. So there, speakers might find a way of expressing this distinction through some other means. Yeah, and in that way, new grammatical structures are introduced to a language. And if other people catch on and use that in the same way, then a grammatical device would have been borrowed into a new language. This is not really an isolated example, but linguists have found that the more intense language contact is, the more likely it is that one grammatical structure will make its way into the other language, and speakers will actually start using these structures. And that, of course, that's a two-way street. So the grammars of languages that are spoken in close proximity, well, there will usually be features that will originate in one and then be found in the other language as well. But all of that being said, you're of course right. It is easy to pick up a few words from a different language. It is much harder to pick up the entire grammar of a different language. But actually these transfer phenomena, they testify to that difficulty. Adult speakers learn another language. They do so imperfectly. Yeah? So for children, it is very, very easy to pick up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 languages and speak them simultaneously, perfectly, if you like. Yeah. But for adult speakers, that is speakers who have passed puberty and who have come to live with 1 or 2 languages that they speak as their first languages, for them to pick up a new one, that will not happen without reasonable difficulty, and it will never have the same perfect result as it would for a child. And so when adults learn second languages imperfectly, that usually goes along with some degree of language mixing or transferring aspects of one language to another. And that, of course, in addition to other things like, for example, maintaining a second language accent so that you can hear, all right, this person did not learn this language as their first language, but rather they learned it as an adult, and you can still hear it in the way they pronounce their consonants and vowels.
I would like you to also talk a little about Globe, the website Globe, the corpus.
Oh, yes.
But before that, we will talk about this transfer happening in Tamil context. Is there any work in your university, among your peers who's doing any work on Tamil?
I'm afraid not. My university actually just has a relatively small linguistics department, and I myself, I'm working in an English department. So really the closest that I would come to Tamil would be in research that analyzes contact situations between English and Tamil. So this is not Tamil, of course, but a long time ago, I've actually studied Sinhala. Well, there are of course many bilingual speakers who also speak Tamil. that was a long time ago. Don't expect me to hold a conversation in Sinhala, but
I
have
don't know. I
friends.
don't know Sinhala. I don't know Sinhala, and if I'm not wrong, it is not from the same family. I don't know.
No, it's actually an Indo-European language. It's very, very remote, but still.
Okay. That the transfer, you were talking about the transfer, because it is very interesting to see this transfer happening, because the British ruled India.
Mhm.
There is a structure which is fascinating, because as I told you earlier in the interview, we are allowed to use an English verb in our sentence.
Mhm.
For example, if I have to tell you to wait, which is an imperative, I just have to add Tamil verb for do. Wait is
Mhm.
wait pannu.
Mhm.
So if I have to ask you to clean, clean pannu.
Mhm.
If
Mhm.
I have to ask you to call pannu.
Yeah, yeah.
And now this pannu takes the burden of conjugation. The speaker or the learner need not go through the stress of knowing all the verb conjugations. So they just attach the
I see.
pannu and life becomes easy. And
Yeah,
Tamil is a
yeah,
verb
yeah.
final language. So, okay, that's something about Tamil. So this kind of transfers, is there anything in other parts where the British ruled? Is there any kind of structural phenomena like this, any phenomena like this, like that's happened in India? Is there anything anywhere else in the world?
I'm afraid I cannot give you like concrete examples of that. So there, my knowledge is much too limited. But what you describe sounds like phenomena that would happen actually in lots of contexts. So that a lexical item of another language is used in a syntactic or morphological context of a structure that that is available in a speaker's first language. Yeah, so that would be a very frequent phenomenon in borrowing. So that for example, well, maybe one example that I can give from my own native language. So I was raised speaking German, and German, of course, borrows lots of verbs as well from English. So, for example, download, that is a concept that was borrowed with that verb into German. And interestingly enough, when you use that verb as a German speaker, you use the German inflection on the English verb. So that means that the verb is actually incorporated into the grammar. Yeah. And it is not treated as a foreign element, but rather it behaves.
Like German.
It is submitted to the same grammatical processes that are also at work when you use a native German verb.
Yeah, I understand that, because we also have that, because for us, beautifully, carefully, all of them take the inflection ah, careful ah, beautiful ah, and they obey the same rules. Like araga, beautiful ah is araga, so the ah is the ah of Tamil is inserted in the beautiful English beautiful, so beautiful ah it becomes. So I understand what you're saying. One thing I wanted to ask you before going into globe and corpus is how does a word completely change meaning in another place? Like, for example, we have one very famous English word, which is not English anymore because it does not have the same meaning. The word is assault. The word assault in Tamil means easy. So how does that happen? Is there any example you can give in any other languages for us?
Generally, the way words change their meanings is through association by context. So maybe I can give you an example of a grammatical word changing meaning, and that would be the English clause connector since. So since originally expresses a temporal relation. So when I say we've been talking since 4:30, that expresses a temporal relation. Now, since also, let's say that speakers encounter the word since in expressions like John has been very miserable since Mary left him.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a temporal relation, but at the same time, there's more going on. So yes, John has been miserable after Mary left, but also because Mary left. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that way, words like since can become enriched with a new meaning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And eventually, speakers form the idea that you can use it with only the causal meaning. So, for example, well, since dolphins are mammals, they can't breathe underwater. Yeah. So that has nothing to do with a temporal relation.
It's because you're replacing because.
I'm replacing it with because. Yeah. This is a general process that works not only with grammatical words, but also with other words. So if speakers mean something in addition by using a word, they, well, this leads to the change of the meaning of those words. And a domain where this can be observed rather frequently is with derogatory terms. I can only come up with like a somewhat archaic example here. So if you call someone a peasant, the association would be, well, someone making their living in the countryside. They're poor, they're not well educated, and so on and so forth. So it's easy to get these derogatory overtones. And then in the end, the derogatory meaning can become conventionalized, and then what you have is essentially an insult. That happens all the time, basically.
There's another example, which is a recent one that comes to my mind, is savage. The word savage has become something to do with cool, being cool.
Yeah. So of course, if you use a term and the intention is that you approve, you positively evaluate something, then that word will take on this meaning, at least for a little while, and in a certain group. And that's how you end up with new word meanings.
Great. So now, if you can talk a little about globe, how does this process go about building a corpus? Like if I want to build a corpus for Tamar, but first if you can talk about globe and how it's useful. And if I type assault in globe and look up globe, will it give me a context? I'm really interested in looking up assault, because it's totally different. And when assault is pops up in the search, in what context is it pops up? I'd like to see that. And if you can talk about globe, and that would be nice. And building a corpus.
Okay. Yes. So the Globe website. So that's GLOWBE. That is a website that hosts a large linguistic database that can be used to analyze and compare different varieties of English. And the way this is done is that the database hosts text materials from all of these different varieties of English. So English as spoken in the United States, in Ireland, in Nigeria, in Australia, in the Philippines, and so on and so forth. So you can think of it as a large text collection that is searchable. So you can enter a search term that could be word, that could be a pattern of several words, one after the other, or it could even be a combination of word types. So for example, adjective plus noun, something like that. And you can search for that, and the website will actually give you a collection of examples that correspond to your search. That means that you see a search word in context. You see the words that appear to the left and to the right. And in that sense, you can find out more about the way a certain word is used in one variety or across several varieties, or maybe in a group of varieties. You can also compare, let's say, for example, American English to Australian English, or how Englishes in Southeast Asia use a certain term. So that's basically what the website is good for. the website has been developed by a linguist by the name of Mark Davies, who's working at an American university. He has been instrumental in providing many of us with this type of resource, which is not only useful for research, but also for language teaching. Many times when I write in a foreign language and I'm not quite sure if what I'm writing is correct, I tend to go to a website like that and see if what I'm trying to write has been already written in this kind of way before. And that gives me an idea of, whether what I'm writing is actually correct. So there are multiple uses, multiple purposes to a website like this one. Now, you asked about compiling a corpus yourself. So the way this is done, I should say that there are two different aspects to it. So the collection of the data, that is one aspect, and the presentation of the data on a website like that, that is the second aspect. So the collection of texts, that can be relatively straightforward. So what linguists often do is that they take material that is publicly available, for example, over the internet, so that texts that are available online are collected and assembled in a database that represents a certain type of language use. So that could be novels, it could be newspapers, it could be transcripts of discussions that take place on television. So basically anything that linguists can get their hands on. And then those materials are brought into a common format so that they become searchable with specialized software. Usually that there are formats like, for example, XML format that are commonly used, not only in linguistics, but in computer science more generally, for databases that can then be exploited and searched with specialized software. And this is what linguists do with language data. Yeah? And the fact that this is done by linguists for linguists means that quite often there is annotation for linguistic categories. So for example, part of speech categories, whether something is a noun or a verb or a preposition. Quite often there's annotation for the beginning and end of sentences, the beginning and end of paragraphs. So the data, there's metadata where a text comes from. If there are speakers, are the speakers male or female? What are their ages, and so on and so forth. And those resources then are used by linguists in order to answer very specific research questions that they have. So the name for these linguistic databases, that's a corpus, plural is corpora, and they form the basis for lots of linguistic research where linguists try to detect patterns in language use. So the example you mentioned, assault having changed its meaning, that would be a prototypical example where linguists would turn to a corpus and they would typically try to see, okay, what elements in the contexts of assault, where speakers or writers use that term, where is the probable origin for the meaning change that we can observe? In what contexts did assault take on a new meaning? And what is the temporal contour of the change? So when did things start happening? What is happening right now? Who is using which meaning, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the starting point that I could point out here.
Yeah, I would like to. At this point, I want to suggest to anyone who's going to watch this video to watch your video on the explanation, because the website is not very easy to use. It's like flying an airplane. It's like being in a cockpit with too many controls. But your video is very useful to go through, navigate through the website. And thank you for putting it out for us. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for taking this time out. It was a pleasure talking to you. there's more to talk about, perhaps in another interview again. But thank you for taking this time out for doing this, to do this for us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was a real pleasure talking to you. And I look forward to talking to you again.
A conversation with Professor Hilpert for the reinforced ideas that the series on language has brought to the fore. His thoughts on how we tend to make judgments that are not based on fact, but that come about through association with language clearly shows the importance we need to place on language, how we speak it and how we hear it spoken to us. That it's the bridge that connects the world makes it all the more important for us to become conscious of what language is, along with its potential and limitations. It will be wonderful to know your thoughts on the interview and if it inspired your worldview in any way. We will see you with another interesting mind, demystifying another interesting topic. Until then, take care.